Monday, Akua here. I also respond to Aqua and Akua. And I'm really excited about today's topic. I feel like I always say that, but today I think that this is such an important topic. If anything, this is sort of the basis of what my work sort of builds upon, because I think this is really the first step that any leader needs to get very clear on. So whether you are a CEO, whether you're a founder, whether you consider yourself a business owner, even if you are a middle manager, I truly feel like what I'm going to share today, and I'm also going to share a resource that as of today is still free. I think it'll be incredibly helpful for you. And as I mentioned before, this is really the basis of the work that I do. I think that having a clear understanding of what I'm going to share today only helps you become a better, more impactful, more inspiring, or more of a proactive leader. It really is about supporting you from being reactive to being a lot more proactive. Proactive. And that's what today's chat is all about. As always, if you have any thoughts for me, any questions for me, feel free to leave it in the comments or in the chat. You're also welcome to reach out via the DMs. I always love sharing my perspectives and thoughts and tools and resources in the DMs. So you're welcome to reach out there. So for those of you who are maybe joining this live stream for the first time, I am a certified executive and leadership coach, a recognized facilitator and speaker. And my favorite thing to do is to really support leaders so they're focusing their time and their energy on the right things. So they really are able to step up into that leadership position and they can really be proactive. What do I mean by being proactive? Proactive to me involves three basic elements. That means that they're constantly cultivating their self-awareness. They're constantly thinking about how to engage with themselves and others. And finally, they're able to set expectations that they exceed because they're constantly checking in, they're constantly experimenting, and they really know where they are and how they feel so they don't burn out and that they're not creating expectations that burn out their team as well. So today I am talking about three assumptions that first-time founders, leaders, once again, you can really replace that term with any leadership term that you want. But these are three assumptions that leaders make about leadership and management. So depending on which platform you're watching this on, I might have had to truncate the title of this conversation just because most places can't take many characters. But the full title of this was supposed to be A+ employees don't work for B- leaders. Three assumptions that first-time founders and leaders make about leadership and management. And I actually like to use the word leadership and management actually interchangeably because I believe that good leaders, good founders, good CEOs are also really good managers or are creating systems and bringing on people to help them with that management piece. So I use them interchangeably. Okay, so I truly believe that for a business, for a startup to succeed, it's not good enough just to have a good business idea or funding. And if anything, this conversation has been slightly shifted by some people who reached out to me this weekend about my thoughts on something that they shared. Because from my perspective, I was like, that's great that you have great funding. It's great that you have a great idea, but what you've shared with me, I don't think will attract the right people. Or if it does attract people, if this is a true reflection of the culture you're trying to create, they're not going to stay there very long. And ultimately, you can't build a business in a vacuum. You can't build your empire. You can't build your brand without yourself. And if you're not able to, attract people, retain those people, it's going to be really hard for you to build. And so I truly believe that leadership skills are just as crucial for success, whether you are at the top of the company or the bottom of the company. Constantly being curious and cultivating your self-awareness and thinking about how you're showing up and engaging with others is truly going to be key. So if you are tuning into this live stream, my hope is that by the end of this conversation, you have some ideas, some tricks, some tips, some techniques that you can leverage immediately to help shift your perspective on some assumptions or stories that you're making. Another thing that you'll probably hear me do in this live stream is use words like assumptions, beliefs, and stories interchangeably. That's because though you can have different definitions for them, I think what's really important is that you're taking the time to reflect and getting really curious about what's coming up for you and the stories that you're telling yourself. If anything, I think that stories really does encapsulate, right? Whether you call them limiting beliefs, assumptions, interpretations, what have you. Once again, there are specific definitions for each of those things, but because this is really that beginner, this is the first step element of this, I really don't want to confuse you with some of that terminology. So we'll just stick with stories. If you are interested in hearing some of the differences between those, and once again, some of the more specific tools and techniques that you can use for each of them, I really would welcome that you check out a course, a leadership focused course that I did for Arlan Hamilton's Academy, where I actually go through the three basic types of beliefs or stories that might be getting in your way and some of the things that you can do to work through that. I'll make sure that I leave the link to that in the comments. And as of right now, I do believe that it's still free. But really being able to focus on those people skills, but it really starts with you, right? So it's not necessarily about everyone else. It really starts with you. And I think that if you look at the research, typically, right, towards the top of why a company or why a startup is failing is typically because of the people. Because at the end of the day, it's people within those companies, within those startups that are making decision. And so the more curious you are about your decision making, the more curious and open you are to reflecting and getting an idea of what's happening and how that's impacting other people, the better. Okay, so this conversation truly is for you if you feel like you're not getting enough productivity from your team, you're not getting enough engagement from your team. You might also be getting some negative feedback from your team as well. I think that some of the things I'm going to share in here today are also incredibly helpful if maybe you have very little experience in developing other people or motivating other people. And I think that this is also incredibly helpful when I'm going to share for leaders that have issues with recruiting, retaining, or developing top talent. If you find yourself saying, hey, like for some reason I'm getting a lot of pushback, I feel like I'm not being listened to, people aren't doing what I'm asking, I think that this is really, once again, going to be a great conversation for you to listen into. If you're listening also to the replay, let me know in the comments, let me know in the chat as well, because I do think it's an incredibly important conversation to have with yourself and potentially other people. So those of you who are joining me, thank you so much. Great to see you. Hi, David. Thank you so much for joining. And I agree, it always comes down to people. And that's why it's so important for us to get very curious about what are the stories we're telling ourselves around these people. All right. So at the end of the day, what I find is that there are three main stories. And once again, we can use other words for stories. We can talk about them from the perspective as perspectives as being assumptions, but there is a definition to assumptions. And maybe I'll get into that a little bit more. But there are three main stories I think that leaders tend to tell themselves. I think the first story that leaders tend to tell themselves is that everyone is like me. And so as we go and we're talking to other people, we're having conversations, we have this assumption, right? In this case, an assumption is a belief that is based on the premise that because something happened in the past, it is automatically going to happen again. So maybe in the past, someone was similar to you or had a similar thought process to you or approached things in a similar way. And so you start to engage with everyone as if they are similar to you. So that's definitely, I think, one of the first assumptions or first stories that leaders tend to tell themselves. And it's not always the best story, because what ends up happening is that you start to feel like you don't necessarily need to explain things, right? Or that you get upset and disappointed and potentially even stressed out when people are showing up in a way that's different from how you would do it. So that's really the first story that leaders tend to tell themselves, and that quickly, right, will downgrade you from being that A+ leader to a B- leader, because what you're doing here, right, is you're making an assumption, and that's not helpful for you moving forward, and that's not helpful for your business. So that's really the first story that leaders tend to tell themselves. And if you find yourself saying that a lot, and it could look like, why aren't my teammates as motivated as me? Why won't my teammates work as hard as me? Why does this person do X, Y, and Z, right? They should be more like me because of whatever similarities that you might perceive. So that's the first one I see in here. So I do see that I do have a question in the chat. And the question in the chat I see here is, how different do you think leadership management in Africa differs from other places? I think that's actually a really great question. And maybe at some point in time, actually, I will do an entire live and maybe even a podcast episode about this. So one of the reasons why I think I'm uniquely qualified actually to answer that question is because I did do an MBA at an African focused or even an African institution. And it was really focused on leadership, right? And one of the questions we asked ourselves constantly is that, is there a different definition of leadership on the continent? What I believe, and I think that if anyone has had the opportunity to work with me and they've seen my work, I do think that there are some global principles. But the key at the end of the day is recognizing that leadership is a very personal, you could even say potentially intimate issue. And so, though we do look at others, so depending on the context you're in, the region that you're in, there will be different models of leadership. And as human beings, right? And this could also be a story that we tend to tell ourselves, right? Is I see this particular particular leader showing up in a certain way. I see that it gets results, and therefore I'm going to show up in a similar way. So what you could potentially say is that there are certain ways in which leaders do tend to show up in different regions, and because of that, you might see a lot of people showing up in a similar way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that leadership or management is any different, right? On a whole, on the continent, right? I do think it's very varied and very, different depending on where you are. But what that does mean is, unfortunately, if there are things or ways in which people are showing up that aren't necessarily leading to results, unless you are having conversations with yourself, that's through reflection, right? Or people are providing you the appropriate feedback and you've built systems so they can provide you that feedback. What will end up happening is that a lot of those poor leadership and management, approaches will continue to be used because there's been nothing that's going to shift it or pivot it. So I hope that answers your question, David. But long story short, how do I think it's different? I don't think it's necessarily different. What I do potentially think is different is what models people are using. But in terms of how people are showing up in ways that are potentially negative, I think you see the same thing in different places. What once again might be different are the institutions or the ways in which people can provide that feedback and feel comfortable providing that feedback. All right. So that was a little ad hoc thoughts. Like I said, I would love actually to do a podcast episode or another sort of conversation about this where I've had the opportunity to think a little bit more about it and sort of synthesize it. But I think overall, it just comes down to modeling, because a lot of what we do as human beings is what we've seen other people do and what we think works for other people. All right. So what is the second story that we tend to tell ourselves? So going back to what I wanted to share today. So the second story that we tend to tell ourselves is that we know that person, right? So this really comes from, you could say the perspective of being biased as human beings, right? We jump to these conclusions about knowing what a person needs or what a person wants. We do that a lot based on maybe what we perceive about that person based on their physical appearance. We do that based on where potentially that person went to school. We do that potentially based on how people sound, right? That's something that I get a lot, right? Because I sound a certain way, people make assumptions about what I would need, what I know, and what I don't know. That's something that we also do as leaders. And I think that one of the key things that, once again, we can do as leaders is get really curious and actually get to know the people who are working for us, right? So a story you might tell yourself that's getting in the way of your leadership for the second point might be, I know what that person wants without actually engaging with them, right? So you feel like, hey, I know what they want because they went to a similar school. I know what they want because they're from this particular country, right? So really just recognizing that that's not doing you any favors, and you need to take the time to engage, right? To get a better understanding of that person's, right, interest. What's going to be, exciting for them, right? What do they want to learn? Why are they even within this position? It's really your role as a leader to create that enabling environment, right? So that they are able to be successful. So they are able to support you in whatever goals that you've set for the business and that you've set for them. But a key thing here to recognize, right, and that's that first step, is that they are not you, right? So that assumption that they're you is not going to help you. It's important to get to know them. And so for a lot of people that I have conversations with, and I'm taking them through these three assumptions, the first thing that pops up is that, hey, I don't have time to get to know them, right? I don't have the time, I don't have the bandwidth, and potentially even I don't want to make the time, and I don't want to, create space for this. But I have news for you. As a leader, that is your job. Your job is to get to know the people who are going to support you and to help you get to the next level. If you can't do it, you either need to find someone who can support you with it, or you just need to say goodbye, because it's going to be really difficult for you to build anything sustainable if you're not bringing people along, if you're not able to engage with them so you're able to retain them over a long period of time. right? If another thing that comes to mind that says, hey, I'm able to retain people, but I don't really engage with them, right? Once again, I'd love for you to check in actually on their engagement levels. Could you be getting more out of them, right? Could they be more productive? Right? Could they be, even more, could you even be more hands off, right? If you find yourself having to micromanage or you find that a lot of things are slipping through the cracks, that's also not to your benefit. And by engaging with them and getting a better understanding of their situation and what they want out of working with you, once again, you can go a lot further. All right. So that second story that we tend to tell ourselves that's probably not working to our advantage is, hey, I know that person, right? I know what they want. In reality, you don't know what they want. So you need to engage and get a better understanding of that. Okay. What's the third one here? And I think this third one is very key. If anything, it sort of builds off the other two. So the third one here is, making the assumption, the story you're telling yourself is, hey, they know exactly what I want, right? That's something I used to do all the time as a leader. I thought that I'd give someone a task and be like, okay, done, great, moving on. And they would know exactly what I wanted and what needed to happen. Long story short, it doesn't work like that, especially if you're building a startup from scratch. I've also seen this be an issue also within larger corporations that do have structures in place. You really need to recognize that through engaging and learning more about an individual on your team, you also need to go out of your way to make sure that you're on the same page about what success looks like. And that's my favorite way actually about talking about expectations. Once again, expectations can look different for every company, but ultimately the question you need to ask yourself is, what does success look like? So some companies that might be sort of expressed in KPIs or OKRs. It could be expressed in SMART goals, right? There's so many different ways in which we talk about it. If anything, I find it incredibly tiring and very overwhelming, the ways in which we talk about it, because ultimately the question we need to be answering is, what does success look like? And am I giving that individual the resources they need in order to get there, right? That's the key question we should be asking, right? You can have the prettiest goal setting chart, you can do all this work, but ultimately, if everyone is on the same page about what success looks like and they don't have the resources, the tools, and also bandwidth and time to do it, it doesn't matter, because ultimately nothing's going to get done, right? So that last story that you're telling yourself of, hey, I've given it to them, it's all good, I can go off and do other things, is probably not going to work to your advantage, especially if you're just starting out, or especially if you've just brought on a new employee, right? It takes you taking the time to train them or coach them, onboarding them properly, making sure that you're providing them feedback throughout the process to make sure that they get to that next level, right? So that you could truly be hands off. You don't feel the need to micromanage, and everyone's truly walking towards the same direction. All right. So those are the three stories I think that a lot of first-time leaders, a lot of first-time founders tend to tell themselves that really, once again, is not to their advantage and definitely not to the advantage of their business. So that first one is telling themselves that, hey, everyone's just like me or should just be like me. So therefore, right, all my thoughts, the way in which I show up and approach people is going to be just like me. The second story they tend to tell themselves is like, I don't need to engage with other people, right? I don't have the time for it. I don't have the capacity. That's not my role as a leader. Like, they'll tell me, about themselves when they get the chance. The reality is that no, you have to create that space, and that's your job really as a leader, to create that enabling environment. And then the last story that leaders tend to tell themselves is, right, yeah, they know exactly what I want because they can read my mind. I've told them once, and that's all that's needed, and that's all that's necessary. And no, that is not the case. You need to check in constantly. If you're working with someone new, sometimes it does take you checking in a lot more in the beginning, and hopefully it does taper off. If it doesn't taper off, then we need to have another conversation about whether or not they're the right person for that position, because there might be a mismatch in the actual capabilities or potentially the tools and resources they're being provided. All right, so I hope that makes a lot of sense for those of you who've taken the time to join me. Please let me know what you thought of these three assumptions that I've shared today. Let me also know what additional assumptions first-time founders and leaders tend to make about leadership and also management. As I mentioned earlier on, I tend to use the two interchangeably because I think that good founders, good leaders are also really great managers. And also, if they're not the best managers, can create systems and bring on the right people, right? So everything is managed appropriately. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to share. I just wanted to look down really quickly to make sure that everything is covered, and I think it was covered. Once again, if you are interested in hearing a little bit more about my perspective about how to work through and shift some of these stories that you might be telling yourself, I shared a few ways and a few questions that you could ask yourself, but some additional ways can be found in my course, A Players Don't Work for B Leaders. It's a course that's currently free at the time of recording this on Arlan's Academy. Once again, I will leave a link in the comments or the post or description so you can check it out. Let me know if you do check it out and let me know what you think. All right. As always, thank you so much for joining me. Stay safe and stay sane. Have a great week. Bye.